Ishita. So in Durganand's presentation, towards the end there are some empty slides and then this is randomly coming.
Yeah, there are a few empty slides. Even in the text presentation that he sent, the last few slides are all empty.
So,
and even the pages that are there have like random shapes in between them.
but it's like this only.
He was supposed to do a dry run, so I was supposed to like sort of get. I thought he'll notice them.
We should
he
tell
didn't
him,
do
no?
that. But he's been busy talking to people every step he walks in.
Yeah.
I've not had the opportunity to tell him. Should I forget him? He'll start talking to everybody.
So ये भी चल रहा है ना?
नहीं ये ऑफ रखा है अभी.
So we will be giving the opening address. So that time can you turn it on?
I'll coordinate.
Okay. Yeah?
Wait for 15 minutes, no?
No?
Because people are not here.
Yeah, but now the 15 minutes is a lot. So then we'll start with Durganand's presentation.
Because anyway this has to fill.
Yeah, okay. Fine, then we'll wait for the figures full, then we'll start. Yes, so now after this slide,
That's the last.
okay, because then there was one
This
over
I
here.
kept. I was not sure whether to put it or not.
Mhm. So should I?
Want delete to delete. This was more.
Okay.
I wanted to say all this was there in our time, and this got condensed to this.
Okay.
I didn't know it fits in the lecture or not. I did it.
Mhm.
Then I was not knowing where to fix it, so I left it.
So should I remove it from the presentation?
Yeah, I didn't know where to fit it. It's a nice
So
one.
then
but
this will your presentation will end over here.
it ends here.
Okay, then I'll delete the
Delete
empty
this.
यहाँ पे
slides.
thank you लिखना.
नहीं नहीं.
ठीक है.
Presentation is thank you.
चलो I'll take that. Don't keep it in your pocket by any chance, because if the receiver this touches anything, it will shout. Keep it.
Yes, so I'll give my opening address and you can keep this up to that. Okay.
And this you put it onto this outside. थोड़ा tight है. This is to be out. Don't come. Right now this mic is on. So once they finish. It's already connected. I connect this. He just wants to check the.
Yeah. What is happening with? Is that a message or not? Hi everyone, we'll be starting in a minute. Could everyone who's standing at the back please take a seat? Good evening everyone. Welcome to the Kurula Varkey Design Forum 2024. Founded in the memory of Professor Kurula Varkey, the forum is a student-led platform that brings together students from various architectural schools across South Asia to foster discussions on current architectural discourse. Professor Kurula Varkey was the director of the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, now CEP University, for 15 years from 1986 to 2001. Varkey and his work played a pivotal role in shaping the architectural educational curriculum at CEPT, and many of his pedagogical ideas on architectural education were adopted by the Council of Architecture in New Delhi to shape the national curricula for colleges of architecture across India. Varkey believed final year student projects to be the pinnacle of one's architectural education. The forum was thus envisioned as a platform that uses these projects as a catalyst for discussions to extend their scope by facilitating conversations on larger concerns relevant to the architectural fraternity. Birthed at the turn of the millennia, the first Kurula Varkey Design Forum at CEP University took place in 2001. Over the last few years, the forum evolved to discuss a particular theme for every year. For the forum's 23rd chapter, we aim to investigate innovation in the built environment and the technologies that enable them. Throughout the history of humankind, every leap of progress can be attributed to an innovation aided by technology of that time. Advancements and shifts in technology have deeply shaped the way people live over the years, and therefore the spaces they inhabit. The forum will look into the opportunities that futuristic, high-tech, and digital technologies hold for architects and their impact on space making. However, there is still a large part of the world that looks at technology differently. Interpretations of technology vary based on context, and hence, interpretations of innovation may also vary. The forum will also look into technologies of the hand, labor-intensive technologies, and even local crafts to understand what architectural innovation may mean in different contexts. We are honored to have with us Durganand Balsavar, an alumnus and one of the first teaching associates at School of Architecture. During his undergraduation in the late 80s, he went to ETH Zurich as an exchange student. Later, he worked at Atelier Bernard Korn in Paris and at Vastu Shilp Foundation with B.V. Doshi. He has been a visiting faculty at School of Architecture with Professor Varkey. Durganand Balsavar formed Arts Roots Collaborative, an interdisciplinary research practice involved in academia, environment, urban habitat, participatory community housing, alternative energies, and war refugees. Balsavar is a RIBA International Awards Jury Ambassador for the year 2024. He's also an advisory member at Avni Institute of Design in Calicut. He has been a part of SIAC reviews and on the jury for the drawing board. We now invite Durganand Balsavar to give the memorial lecture on Professor Varkey, as well as a note on the theme for this year.
you for the invitation to the Kurula Varkey Forum. and it's after receiving the invitation, one realized that 40 years have passed. Till then you don't recognize time. And what was interesting was the kind of questions that the different students and the Kurula Varkey team, the Design Foundation team, were raising. And many of these questions, so let me begin by thanking Ninad, Tanvi, Shreya, the KVDF team, the faculty who were involved supporting them. I think Alice and Mayuri were to be here, and Professor Chaya is here. It was wonderful to Professor Chaya was here, and Riaz, many of them. Mona's come from Orwell, so it's really wonderful to meet all of them after so long. Uday, Karthikay, Shubhra, several more. So when the KVDF team spoke to me, their intent, of course, was to understand technology and innovation, words I mentioned to them I normally don't easily use, but for the sake of this presentation may emerge quite often. But their idea was to look at the times we're living in and the times that may unfold, where probably the whole of humanity now is contemplating on the rapidity of change. Rapidity not only of what we're discussing as a climate emergency, a rapidity of technological change, along with rapidity of social change, and a whole multiplicity of changes, which is beginning to invite new forms of imagination if we have to make sense of the world around us. And I found that was a kind of a restless underpinning of this theme. But at the end of it, they said they were keen to also understand the pre-digital era. Now that's a term I'm conjuring for the moment, for want of a better word. So there were these, and I suddenly realized many of us were in. Now these are all conjured for the sake of paucity of time and for 1 hour, and to kind of present what this could mean. So many of us from the 60s, 80s find, now these are temporary categories to be discarded after this talk. Crudely, a pre-digital era. In the 90s, we were doing an urban studio with Professor Chaya when it's on. It's on. I put it off. So you have to remember all the Cartesian points of your building and type it in, and then you say enter. You say enter at 9 in the night, and at great speed the next morning your drawing is ready by 7 o'clock in the morning. So that was AutoCAD, and we were surprised at the speed at which now drawings can be done. A computer opened in 15 or 20 minutes, really fast, and that's how we worked. So that was, I hold, the beginning of, now these are crude, the beginning of maybe the first digital phase, of computer aided design, and which, for sake of a better term, scale was lost because now you could zoom in and zoom out. You could array, and that coordination, in which probably scholars like Giovanni Pallasma and the others are very skeptical about, that coordination between brain and hand was being bartered to the computer. Now I'm giving Pallasma's point. Bartered to the computer because if earlier one had to do a drawing, or one had to make a model, or one had to build, there was a direct connection between the hand, which is actually the extension of the brain. And so if you are drawing a line, you would draw the line in the way you think, and the hand would also move. Sounds simple. And then the computer came in, which meant that whether you want to draw a long line, short line, vertical, you had to only do this. There was no movement other than. So then the coordination moves into the computer beginning to decide, based on the way in which it is positioned, the drawing of the line. So it kind of created a new kind of distance. So if Renaissance had created the first distance of actually making a drawing in an architect's office, and not a direct immersive construction on site, AutoCAD did the next distancing in terms of imagining a drawing, in terms of a representation of a drawing, and inadvertently made scale more challenging to apprehend. And because you could zoom in, I could draw 100 scale, zoom in, zoom out, it becomes 1000 scale, 50 scale. That's the felicity of a computer. And now we are on the anvil of when we think the machine can think as well. We have AI, we have the metaverse, which people like Noam Chomsky, sometimes even Arundhati Roy, would say at one level is a boon, but also express a cautious skepticism on what is this new relationship between the human being and technology. But for the sake of this talk, I've forgotten the slides now. So the question I asked them, how do I do? Yeah. So the question I asked the KVDF team, and which I would hope we all ask, is it really relevant to go back to that time? Is it really relevant to go to a pre-digital time when Professor Varkey was heading the school, to understand our present position? Extending that question, we could even ask, is history relevant, or are we taking it for granted it is relevant? And these are questions. One is not taking a position whether it's relevant or not. These are a series of questions which we could raise, and we were just seeing the projects and the panels in the Sagra basement, and I was thinking there's so much of creative expression and thinking and a youthful restlessness that these questions raised me emerge intuitions which we have not thought about before. And I think a forum of this kind, when it was created and even as a tribute to Professor Varkey, would be one of keeping an open-ended questioning rather than a prescription of whether this is right or that technology. Or I think that is the responsibility of each unto themselves. So this presentation is more, actually it's a little random, but hopes to raise certain questions that we are asking ourselves in our studio, but may be of interest or may be of relevance to those who are interested. So there are two, and the slides may not really be in tune with what I am talking. That's a parallel story that will run. So this is broad. This is the broad direction of today's talk. So if we were to begin for the sake of some referencing, again that referencing may be discarded at the end of the talk. These are all temporary provisional referencing. And if we looked at a time pre-Renaissance, when we looked at cultures that were deeply engaged with the act of construction, deeply engaged without the distance of drawing and then constructing on site, and largely canonical, largely guided by cultural practice than the figure of an individualistic architect, which means there was a very tacit agreement among community on what maybe Charles Correa would have called a very nuanced term, gestures of inhabitation. So how do we engage with those gestures of inhabitation in a manner that it evolves an architecture of profound conversation? And if we look at cities like Jaipur or even the poles of Ahmedabad, and they were built relatively at a fast speed. It was not as if they took years to deliver those projects. And I'm beginning to wonder whether the speed at which they were constructed, cities like Jaipur, and this is again a matter of provocation, is probably as fast as any developer building a banal project today. And that was because there was a cultural consciousness to the act of construction, to the relationship to environment. Of course, there were hierarchies among communities, we are aware of that. It was not an egalitarian or a democratic community, but there was this kind of tacit agreement that generated the act of inhabitation, the act of construction. So technology was largely a cultural construct. Technology was a cultural consciousness that was ingrained within these communities. Then there is an inflection, again technological, a technological inflection with what is normally termed the Industrial Revolution. A year ago, Professor Frampton had invited me to do a 40-year critique of his writings and to look at this whole notion from 1750 till today through the 5 editions of modern architecture that he produced. So one had to compare each of the edition to see between 1980 and now, when the 5th edition has been released, what kind of differences in the idea of the modern project itself emerged in terms of its relationship to technology. So given the fact that that had just happened, that kind of forms some kind of a underpinning to today's talk, not directly of course, but in some ways the reference is there. And another reference that we had in the 80s was Gideon's book, Space, Time and Architecture. So I thought, and these are random images between probably one of the first recognized modern project building and the Golconda House in Pondicherry. And again, for want of better examples, these are all random, these are not specific examples to convey something. Frank Gehry's work, and to look at its provocation from maybe the time of the Crystal Palace, later the Eiffel Tower, and these have been chosen more from, now given the theme of the KVDF, from a technological imagination and what kind of influence it may have on social grouping, social regrouping, social assembly, or social imagination. The Council of Architecture is presently engaged with attempting to document projects that have happened in India from 1947 till date, and we decided it will be non-evaluative, and the first stage will be just to observe what projects happen rather than jump into an evaluation. And these again are some of the references and books. Of course, there was Vistara in the 80s when Varkey had just come in as director, where there was this urge to return to origins under the disruption that we saw, or what the banal term is globalization. And Miki Desai, Madhavi and John Lang's book, Rahul Mehrotra's book that maps 1990 till date, and then Gemini's recent book. So each are holding very different interpretations of this time. So this idea of returning to origin, this idea of attempting to make sense or search for an anchor in the midst of rapid change, I think that came through in many places as something that the architecture fraternity would like to engage with. So I go back to it more as a reference. There is Mark Zerzombek and Vikram's global history, which changes the sequential understanding of history and looks at simultaneity. So that's another shift. And of course, there's Rickworth talking of the return to origins of a certain kind, and we'll come back to why this return of origin, more in the context of what Professor Varkey was attempting, not as explicitly, but probably implicitly, of a return to a certain kind of grounding. And nomenclature becomes very troublesome and risky in our times today, because I don't think we anymore share the meaning of almost any word. So if we say space, there are already 400 people will think of space as a very different construct. If you say form, it's another construct. You say technology. So we are moving into a veritable, I won't say a Babel tower, but we are moving into a zone where even language is now being tested in this fluidity. So for want of communication, I decided maybe keep the language as ambiguous as possible. So each one can then generate their own meaning in a collaborative way, rather than present as such. So I request each to also collaborate in this imagination, and that this is really a provocation of ideas or thoughts, or random thoughts may be organized under some frame, but attempts to even subvert that frame by suggestions of various other scholars where an idea can have multiple interpretations. So we have even Deepesh Chakrabarty. Professor Chaya introduced Deepesh Chakrabarty's writings to me, who talks of provincializing Europe, and now we've been communicating with Deepesh Chakrabarty, taking on very interesting connotations in the context of climate change, and I'll come to that, on the need to reimagine what we mean by nature, what we mean by environment, and that if we are open to that reimagination, then the manner in which architects or any related discipline relates to the idea of construction itself may transform, mutate, change. So there are certain very strong biases that have been built over the years that kind of inadvertently guides an architect into addressing a project, which I think people like Dr. Latour, Deepesh Chakrabarty are re-questioning at first principles, and it's very interesting to see what they're discussing. Climate emergency, I don't think all of us are aware, and this whole notion of landscape and the manner in which we as humanity have positioned ourselves as human and nature, when actually we are a very deep intrinsic part of nature. There are no two words on that, but we have kind of separated it like a binary, and therefore sometimes stepping back to look at these manifestations of different landscape. I'll come back to this later, and that this really carries a whole load of other ideas in which, so if we are to allude, and now again this is an interpretation, I don't expect agreement on that. If we are to allude to Ivan Illich's H2O and the waters of forgetfulness, and we are to then draw from that, we will find that broadly, and this is a little simplistic but may suffice for the moment, we will broadly see that humanity's connection with nature began with a very deep, profound reverence. It moved into nature as a landscape, which meant a visual kind of visual fascination, and from there nature moved into resource, and nature as, so you had all the extraction, and today nature as commodity. So there are four broad, or maybe more, but broadly four phases in which one engages with nature as reverential, as unknown, mysterious, nature as something just beautiful to be painted, to be enjoyed, nature as resource, and then nature as commodity, two different interpretations. And when nature becomes commodity, it begins to gentrify, it begins to become static, and is kind of boxed in from its dynamism that we're experiencing today. And of course the architect as an integral member of that larger community, kind of what Raul Mehrotra calls impatient capital, is forced into projects that kind of unfold from that idea of nature where it is commodified. So now we come to the idea of technology, again very broad terms, and one has taken a certain liberty here in discussing what one means by technology. Here technology as we understand it, I have taken it more to be relational technology not as residing in machine, but technology as a relationship between human creativity, the artifact or tool, the community, the idea, and nature and material. So the integrative idea of all these aspects is what is being discussed today as technology. More to simplify my task also at one level. So we see technology in its broader sense, technology in its general sense rather than specific machinistic sense as we generally understand it. But if one looks at anthropological or ethnographic studies and tries to see what was that shift, if one can make a small detour, some other thought came in. Professor Ioannis Plasma in one of the conversations with us would tell us that if you watch a spider, you watch a bird, you watch any species on this planet, they have no doubt about their architecture. It's only human beings who carry so much doubt, sit and have discussions on their architecture. So I thought it was important to see when that doubt emerged. And that doubt emerged when, so I've called it, this is extending from Plasma's writings, I've called it that the ancestors of the hand were the feet. So if the ancestors of the hand were the feet, the moment of evolution of the hand as different from the feet and becoming an extension of the mind, I would like to term the first Neil Armstrong moment of technology, and a small step, but that was the moment when the shift happened to create doubt beyond the instinctive. And since then we've been oscillating between the instinct, doubt, is architecture a science, is it an art, is it, all those questions that have come because somebody decided that the feet had to be released and become hands, some forefather of ours, and which is why we've landed in this crisis today. I don't think it's a crisis. And the hand therefore remains an extension of the sensorial experience and a very critical part of this idea that we call technology. And at one level, and I'll go to that later, even etymologically it's revealed, somewhere we want to see technology as very much part of human consciousness, very much part of nature. Though in its enactment there's a certain distance because it's extracted metal, or it is, so we call it natural, extracted, steel is unnatural. But if materials were innocent and human beings were agnostic, I would think, for the sake of provocation, aluminium is as natural as bamboo. That it has adverse environmental impact, or that's an issue of how it is used or extracted, but unto themselves materials are agnostic. So we come now to a phase where this human mind, through its imaginations, is able to generate outside of itself a machine that can simulate or pretend thinking, that can pretend memory, that can pretend to, or like a robot, do what a human being can do. And I consciously use the word pretend because that aspect of human consciousness, and I think if one goes back to Dr. Latour, or goes back to Dipesh Chakrabarti, or even goes back to Frank Gehry and the architects who are probably immersed today in some of the highest technologies on the planet, they are conscious that there's a vast difference between artificial intelligence, AR and VR that we call it, and machine thinking from the infinite possibilities of the human mind. And in their opinion, it's probably another 500 to 1000 years, if at all, that something outside of the human being can evolve that kind of consciousness that is contained in the human mind and body. And I would like to hold that, because if for a moment we were to consider the human being, body, mind, soul, for a moment, as a machine, this machine has evolved over millions of years. It is not so. There's research, I think, in many of these in Cambridge and Oxford that shows that any human being actually carries content which is already billion years old, because this was not generated out of de novo, but generated through a continuity of species. And that we carry within us that genetic memory. And this is not about superstition, this is not about going to a priest to find out and hallucinating. These are easily relatable, that there has been a kind of a baton carrying from one generation to another, and that this material which grows, and we've not yet found out what's the technology of that growth, is really a continuity of billions of years. And I think if we start acknowledging or addressing that issue, we may just open another idea or another imagination of what is our relationship to technology, and what is our relationship to the planet, what is the possibility of relationships to ourselves. And this, I'm saying it in a more as a contemplation, provocation, not to be taken too seriously, but to be played around with. And that when we play around with it, at one level it indicates a certain gravitas, and at another level keeps us conscious of the provocations of the rapid change which we are in, but probably beyond our agency or control also. So I think there are these two aspects, that there is something happening of rapid, and we all seem to share that rapidity. And in there are many studies now which show the manner in which we absorb digital screen image, mind mapping based on a film we see and an actual event is showing that human beings experience the screen as real as the real event. So imagine we watched a war film, or you are in the middle of the war. Even if the intellect kind of clarifies to us that we are watching a film, the body can release hormones and begins to act as if we were in the midst of that situation. So it means that at some subconscious or intuitive level, the images that are being absorbed are beginning to generate other kinds of imaginations within us, which become as real or as reality to us as the imagery of fiction. And I think that's why we get excited, or someone cries at the end of a film, or it's a film, yet we would cry, or we would feel very happy. Some watch a film of Superman and go out of the theater that they are Superman. So all these kind of empathetic relationships happen through our relationship with what we are calling technology. So this is broadly the definition. And I thought since the Eiffel Tower was one inflection, along with the Paris Expo, the Crystal Palace, where this whole imagination that Steele provided, a fascination with the sky. But then if we go into remote Tibet or thousand or more, we'll find that there was more than a fascination, a need to protect their territories, and some amazing stone towers built with a very complex, nuanced understanding of technology, which stand in earthquake zones for millennia. So it really shows another kind of relationship to the act of construction, to the act of safety, to the act of creating a precinct. Assembly, and there have been many scholars who have talked about this idea of assembly, and it's very strange to see that a technological term brings together almost an anthropomorphic imagination, where we see an assembly of elements resonating with an assembly of people. So the idea of assembly again creates this dualistic or understanding of, it could be element, it could be people, it may be construction, which takes on an anthropomorphic idea, and therefore this notion of assembly of, and I go back to it also because I think those were some of the groundings that Professor Varkey was very strongly conscious of in the act of making, that there are elements, they have relationships, how the elements combine, how the articulation is expressed, and how does one nuance it to a certain imagination that was born from what probably, and I've taken the liberty to change the terms, born from what may be a very genealogical approach and the notion of diagram. So Varkey used to make these diagrams with a 6B pencil, and we will probably delve very broadly into those diagrams or what they may mean. It was something that architects have done across centuries, across canons, but this relationship is nuanced between technology, between material, how an architect imagines the combination of materials in manifesting habitation, and which are conscious choices, and they're done with a thought, with a continuity, with a learning from that genealogy. And just as a case in point, one is discussing here Brunelleschi's dome in order to link the idea of technology with maybe a theological understanding of what a dome may convey. And it's an idea of span, it's an idea of weight, it's an idea of construction, it's also an idea of freeing something from the pull of gravity. And that something like this is taken to the point by Brunelleschi. If one studies this, it's very interesting to see that Brunelleschi goes to the point of having to design each tool to even construct it. So he's not imagining it in a BIM or a Revit. I have nothing against BIM and Revit, but I'm saying it is going down to the tool of how this may manifest. And when I saw these images, it reminded me of a measure drawing we had done with Professor Vasavda of the Patan stepwell, which was at the time when my thesis was on. And we probably lived in that well for about 6 or 7 months to document it. But Professor Vasavda was guiding us on each, because there was no laser, there was no, and it's 7 stories. I don't know how we climbed those walls. We climbed and we are safe today. But we measured it through tools that Professor Vasavda was guiding us to make. And when I saw that drawing, I remembered those 6 or 7 months there, that because how do you measure a well when you can't go across to the other point? And how do you measure a 7-story wall which only opens out, with. So there was this whole process of living in the well, measuring it, and in the act of measuring it, beginning to understand its assembly, beginning to understand the forces of the earth and the idea of what the craftsmen, the craft communities were going through in terms of articulating that what we call structure, but in a manner that it transcends its own technology. That it's done in a manner with a kind of a, what Professor Balsavar would call penchant or reverence, that act of technology transcends its very construction. And when I saw that drawing, it reminded me. I had put those images and then removed it because I was not sure, and suddenly now I thought maybe I need to discuss it. So the images are not there. So I come to this idea of genealogy. Of course, that the term alone, not its interpretation, is borrowed from Frampton's book. And I think Frampton is probably a little more direct, whereas probably we would be a little more open-ended in how we look at this idea of genealogy, which is malleable, adaptable, gives an intuition, but doesn't want to prove that it is from the same gharana. That's for somebody else to decide. And which generates a certain geometry of inhabitation, generates a certain geometry of construction, which seems to suggest possibilities of human gathering and human communication that reside in, to use a cruder term, the deployment of technology for a certain aspiration to construct institutions. It could be a small dwelling, it could be a school, it could be the genealogy of a library or an assembly. So there are multiple genealogies, and in the Indian context, I'll come to that later. So we come to the Italian rationalists. The time we were in ETH Zurich, we had Aldo Rossi as our adjunct faculty, and there was Tafuri, and there was all that whole Italian rationalist conversation, French rationalist, and there was a whole load of conversation on this notion of type, a word that probably Varkey borrowed only the term but not its meanings. And so I think Professor Varkey also looked at the idea of type as a contingent word for want of a better word, but in terms of its meanings, in terms of what its possibilities were, in terms of its interpretations, it had a much wider gamut of possibility. And therefore, the drawings were always tentative, the drawings were nebulous. The drawing, if you observed it the next week, could convey something very different. And so therefore that notion of what was canonically presented across time in the Indic or Southeast Asian context was intuitional, was suggestive, and not type that easily then moved into what we today call prototype. Because now the more we want machinistic thinking, this intuitive idea of genealogies, the machine will find very difficult to interpret. It needs type, it needs prototype, it needs clarity, it needs definition, it needs quantification. And it's that difference between intuiting a certain need, a certain aspiration, and yet keeping it open-ended and adaptive to flexibility, that the machine would at best present as 10 deliverables to be checklist. That's not the same as the fluidity of human thought that makes it so malleable and fluid, but it's not free for all. There are underlying relations which are constantly questioned in this technological search, and I think that distinction is probably something one can discuss, look into, so that, because the terms being appropriated by that industry, there's no industry, I'm just calling it architecture, computer memory. A computer can never have memory, it has a storage bin, it can never have memory. But we've used the term memory and we think human memory, and then gradually we think the computer has better memory to remember than the human being. In reality, it's a storage bin. And neurological studies indicate that memory itself is never static. That memory itself modifies in response to our levels of awareness. So memory is not constant. Even if we feel strongly about something and repeat it, it doesn't remain constant, because the interpretation changes the more and more we make sense, or the more and more we get confused about the environment around us. So that's the amazing possibilities of memory, which a machine would find difficult to. So the terminology is used. Let's say when the first factories came, hard, harsh, steel, glass, without sensorial qualities, and you had agricultural communities being transformed into factory, I don't know a good term, the terms they use are not too palatable, but the people who worked in the factory, it's strange to find that the term they use is plant. How did a factory be called a plant? To respond to an agricultural aspiration of an agriculturist being called upon to work in the factory. So these are all terms that a certain industry has kind of employed, deployed, which probably need another kind of discussion or engagement to re-understand an architect's position in this firmament, to understand an architect's position in relationship to what's happening, in the hope that it gives possibilities of a reimagination in the present context. So these are terms it's not as if one has the answers, or one is not looking for the answers, right? But I think an excavation of what kind of historic understandings have come down to us, and a need to re-engage with the very terms at first principles, a return to origin in a very different way, but done with a certain open-ended gaming, playfulness, with a certain Sudoku-like idea, so that we see what other interpretations reside in this relationship. So this is the work of Durand and many others, who kind of defined the idea of type. So you had a very canonical but strict understanding of what a library should be, what a school should be, what a university should be, what a home should be. So these were brought down as a certain need. I don't dispute the need, but these were brought down as a certain need to convey that the practice of architecture should be a rational pursuit. That we need to make it rational, and therefore need a whole series of canons that begins to regulate human human inhabitation, urban space, or the nature of institutions. So we had a high court. The high court was conveyed through a type, and so you couldn't have a high court judge sitting in one corner of that huge symmetrical edifice, but there was a definition made of where the high dome is, and there was all these other layers that begin to reside in these typologies, which have come down till today. So another influence at that time, and which continues to percolate today, is beyond the genealogy or beyond the understanding of technology in constructing a single building or a single artifact, that when a multiplicity of or a diversity of institutions begin to coalesce in a stated or unstated manner in what we may call a habitat or a city or a town, something else begins to happen. That the interrelationship between this, for the sake of the conference, this interrelationship between these technological manifestations generates a very different kind of opportunity in public space or urban space, or the appropriation of life within what we see as the imagination of a city. So technology has that kind of influence and ramification in terms of, is an institution constructed as a large institution, a smaller one, subdued, and there are a whole range of imaginations that go with how these institutions are constructed. So on one hand we have, that's an extract from the Jaipur UNESCO Heritage Library, very interesting note on the act of constructing, planning the city of Jaipur. Almost a standardized process, but in the standardization of assembly, a whole range of creativity and choice that was provided to each of the craftsperson. Two other books, and David Harvey, that's when Bimal had come back from Berkeley, and Professor Chaya, myself and Bimal took an urban studio, and Bimal introduced us to David Harvey, which kind of opened other kinds of discussions within this urban reality. The reason one is coming to that is because if one looked at let's say, I think Professor Chaya's memorial talk on Varkey, very insightful talk. I go back to listen to it quite often, on what did he convey as a human being, what did he convey as an architect, what did he convey as a teacher, what did he convey as in various roles, I think have been very insightfully presented to us. And then another talk by a conversation between Vivekananda and Professor Doshi, who mentored Varkey in the early years. And then you realize a lot of other decision making of how one perceives architecture, how does one evolve those belief systems, how does one kind of look at the formation of the imaginations of an architect. I think that comes through there. So when the KVDF team was talking, I thought it may be, and I think that's what they also intended. If they didn't, I intended, was to look at the ecosystem within, on the planet, on the concerns in the larger context that have been influencing but also in a more general, broader sense, the kind of ecosystem that was growing in SEPT in the pre-digital era. Whether it's relevant now or not is an open question. I wouldn't claim for either, I think, but I think to examine a context, to examine the kind of dejection with the modern project at that time, which is why issues of critical regionalism, Charles Correa and the Vistara, the return to the origins, I think Alexander Zonis, then you had Rickwert, Norberg, Schultz. There was a whole range of scholars at that time beginning to feel an absence because of a technological substitution in terms of function and, for want of a better word, aesthetic, or the privileging of the visual, at times at the cost of human intuition or human consciousness. And I think that was the reason that these kind of conversations began in the mid-80s, which in my mind continue to reside as living energies, which were hastily set aside with the advent of the software parks. And again, they are called parks. So you have plant as a factory, you have parks, and you have assembly. So we begin to think that the machine can, and it probably may, and if it does, we accept it happily, could substitute or engage with human consciousness. If it does, fine, we'll accept it. But as of now, it appears that there is a terminology or an etymology that is probably creating some of the confusions with which we observe the act of making something, act of assembly, the act of disassembly, or the act of maybe what we are calling recycle, or which was something normal. But the minute we call it recycle, it becomes a gentrified value to be held. And so these are the idea of a town. These are all, I would say, very alive thoughts. They may have been written 10 years ago, and this is only a proposition. I don't want that these are thoughts which are still alive, still exist, just because they were 10 years or sometimes even 1,000 years back. A thought may be of value, and something yesterday may not be of any value today. So I think it's an issue of how do we discern the precedent, whether it is a precedent of yesterday, a precedent of 30 years ago, or a precedent of 2,000 years ago. Someone may still feel that the values expounded by Gautam Buddha 500 BC are still valuable today. So I think time or situation in time alone may not be a good categorization to understand whether that precedent is of value or not, and that one needs to re-engage with the precedent from its first origins and from its relevance from first principles, in terms of its. So these are certain provocations of the formation. So I come back to this idea of, there are many more, but for the sake of brevity, I come back to this idea that there could have been 3 possibilities or more of how we re-engage with precedents. Is genealogy and diagram like this mysterious genetic code that carries a set of relationships as a memory, but is open to adapt, grow, flexible, agile, hybrid, celebrating all the contradictions and changes in the environment? So that's one way of imagining a precedent and its possibility. Or is it something like what Rossi was discussing, something that carries a very nostalgic memory, something that carries a memory of cautious optimism. And later during the pandemic, one had the opportunity of actually conversing at length with Rossi's family, with his daughter Vera Rossi and others, quite extensively, to try and understand what Rossi was trying to convey. And then you begin to see that a certain life circumstance begins to color the way in which we are beginning to see what we think is objectively an idea of a precedent or history or technology, but actually colored by our own social upbringing, which is not discerned easily. It appears objective all the time. So that's one. And at the other end, the Vistara idea that suggests possibilities of different technological manifestations across time. It could be the Ajanta Ellora caves. What made a group take that kind of effort to excavate a whole range of caves in a need to better understand self? That can be a question on when one visits Ajanta Ellora. So that's the kind of possibilities that the Vistara or many of the canons of the East and the Southeast seem to convey. An adaptability and openness, yet an indicative intuition of how one may engage. So it's not a free for all, it's not doing anything and everything. There are some broad suggestive parameters which can be modified. Section, by and large, a plan or a section of a building is probably rarely or never experienced. We never experience a section. We experience the spatial manifestation. We experience being in a space, but not a section. Yet, through history, in this technological search, more after Renaissance, the section has remained one of the generators of spatial imagination in its technological manifestation. So I brought this more in the context of an exploration of what this is. And if we go back to our times, it was almost, I think, in Professor Chaya's studio, Varkey's, many of the studios, that the semester ends with a clear drawing of a wall section to see how the building touches the ground, how the building relates to the horizon, and how the edifice generates a conversation with the sky. And I think those conversations reside in the choice of technology, that relates to the idea of human well-being. And that's why this is random. So in the teaching of history, this is something I have gone back to, and I thought I would briefly show this. This is a theological evolution of section and technology, that we try to understand. If it is, for one instance, the idea of a church, or it could be any other institution, it's for the sake of so if we were to begin with Pantheon and look at how probably a sudden discovery of an erupting volcano generated this idea of volcanic lava as concrete and led to the imagination of a space like the Pantheon, which was a technological possibility. And then we have maybe the medieval church, you have the Renaissance church, each attempting to, and this I would place this conversation with Jose Obreri, and who was very generous in this idea of looking at, generous in his conversations, in his idea of looking at what does a section convey. And I was very curious to understand what Corbusier had discussed with José Obreri about Ronchamp and about Firmini. And from there, one started building this up, because ostensibly, Corbusier was an agnostic, if not an atheist, ostensibly. Commissioned to design a church and later a monastery. So it is quite strange, and yet conjures a certain kind of reverential space, which again is a deployment of material, deployment of processes by which a spatial imagination is awakened, but primarily in an understanding of light, the quality of light, the nature of space, and that has the possibility of awakening a certain state of mind for human contemplation. So this is, for the sake of again a better word, a theological exploration of what could be a section. And then I have added something of a project that I have been recently researching, and these drawings were given by Gary, and where you really see the kind of immersion in the design of the Walt Disney Center in a manner that it resonates with an understanding that the human body itself is an auditorium. We speak, we hear, the auditory, and so once it embodies the fact that the human body itself is an auditorium, and then attempts now to connect to the genealogy, and these were discussions with which Gary himself explained to us, a genealogy of Ronchamp. So it's not necessarily a need to link to the same typology, but an imagination which may have a continuity. And then one begins to see that there is an experience of space that can actually evoke those kind of experience and emotions in the way and manner in which it is conjured, whether it's acoustic, quality of light, the way one sits in, the relationship to the stage and the performance, and a whole range of other very exacting standards. It's not an arbitrary, it also sits on one of the most dangerous seismic zones. So imagine an architect taking the risk of such fragments, unless there was a strong structural understanding, to place a building of this nature on a seismic zone with a whole load of legal obligations. And I think that's the kind of course there are arguments on embodied energy, the cost, the extravagance. Those are all, of course, noted, but more in terms of an exploration of a human frontier of imagination, which kind of shows a rigor and discipline to understand what is this primary source of listening and hearing for a human being, that then takes manifestation as an auditorium. So given this fact, and this is something that again came up often in the 80s, and I thought it may be worth recalling now, both in its metaphorical terms and in its quantifiable terms. So in its quantifiable terms, we may ask, have you weighed your building? You know, actually weigh it, you put scales and put it there and see what is the weight of your building. And that if one went back, and in fact that's something that happens here, if one goes back from the Pantheon to see the flying buttresses at Chartres in Paris, you'll see that there was a, whether conscious or not, there was a search to make the edifice lighter, and a relationship of a lighter structure generating a more ethereal quality of light. So there was that search of, and I think one of the sub-themes is architecture as technology, and which again will come in the next. So I thought it kind of resonates with the sub-theme. So this idea of gravity is one, the weight of a building. The other is the manner in which the edifice touches the ground. Glenn Murcutt suggests that a building needs to touch the ground lightly. But it's also related to how human beings stand on the ground, how our feet touch the ground, how the ground plane resists human presence. So there are all these other notions of the idea of gravity which get revealed in the footprint. Genealogy, time, the fact that human beings have been constructing for several centuries leads to the idea of knowledge repositories in the act of building. How do we engage with these knowledge repositories? We may call it a crafts community. We may give various names. Some may call it vernacular, some may call it indigenous. But these are essentially knowledge repositories of how we could inhabit the planet. And so if we look at the act of assembly, we look at the carpenter or the stonemason, and a knowledge system that evolved not from a 5-year program, but a knowledge system that evolved over centuries from one generation to another, to understand an act of assembly that was intuitively related to our well-being and our presence on this planet. And I think those knowledge systems, and I bring in the Parton stepwell here, it was in the Brunelleschi one and shifted here recently, and some of Megal was generous enough to give me a few of those publications, because it was more a connection of what kind of repositories can be generated, which I will later come back to. But I thought this study of the water, the study of how these repositories develop kind of presence, ideas on technological evolution. Knowledge repositories and again building crafts, and so it goes down to the element. So it doesn't remain at the level of an idea or a construction process, but goes down to the element, whether it's a jali, whether it's a handle, whether it is a light. So it really goes down to the detail, and it percolates down to the detail because each stage of that technological articulation begins to convey a possibility of inhabitation. So whether it's the Hawa Mahal, or whether it's the School of Architecture, or the Jawahar Kala Kendra here, these are just random. There are many more that one can present, but these are just indicative directions. And since I'm happy Mona is here, these are the kind of studies, this is Mona and Popo, of looking at this range of, or looking at this imagination from the idea of a genealogy to the detail to the materiality, which kind of, so you're looking at environment, you're looking at materiality, construction, inhabitation, and in a certain relational way that begins to give deeper insights into this act of settling, which is again a continuous process. And so even at Orwell, I think one of the references, whether it is the center or whether it is the manner in which the settlement unfolds, and that's a garden again that Mona had designed, which we had the privilege to experience in the evening. And you begin to see that the choice of material, the choice of detail, the choice of inner kind conveys itself in resonation with nature, in resonation with the human spirit. And I refer to the documentation of praxis that the council is presently engaged in. And I think this repository of just placing from 1947 till date several practices, and then beginning to see what this unfolding of projects, what this unfolding of an architect's imagination has been across the country, northeast, south, I think would kind of lend itself to another kind of conversation. So I come back to this imagination more in the context now what Dipesh Chakrabarti and Latour were discussing. One idea of the satellite image from the moon that we see of planet Earth has generated in us is this idea of a singular nature. And we have kind of singularized nature. And what Dipesh and several seem to convey is that we probably need to re-engage with the interrelatedness of a highly fragmented, diverse nature rather than jump to a conclusion of a singular nature. And that if we got back or take a step back and look at the diversity, a lot of the principles of sustainability, the principles that of climate change may dramatically mutate. That what is sustainable for one region may be completely unsustainable for another region. And I think that conversation of stepping back and not looking at broad rules or broad guidelines of sustainability is what they've proposed in the context of, which means that it comes to a completely new understanding of, for want of a better word, regional technologies, appropriate technologies that are born from within a regional idea rather than an idea of technology that we begin to say works in the northeast or works here, works there. And I think those are the issues that need a new kind of conversation. And I think this kind of makes us reimagine what is the environment and actually celebrate that diversity and re-engage with it in very different terms. This is again coming back to the city at certain, because these are cartographic imaginations of a city, and always seen, there was I recall a journal called Oppositions, and in the term itself, it seems implicit that binaries and dualities compete or oppose one another in the term, rather than an understanding where the binaries, whether it's inside and outside or whatever the binaries, center and periphery, you say earth and sky, actually may be fluid quantum complementaries. So it's really an imagination of, are they fluid complementaries or are they oppositions? And I think when one returns back to these drawings, one begins to see an understanding of architecture in terms of an artifact which is oppositional, which kind of privileges the opposition even between land and water. Even between land and water. So water is to be contained. Land is privileged over water. And I think that is implicit in the manner which we engage with technology, engage with material. And I think here it may be a little straying, but worth bringing it in here. Trideep's interpretation of the latent values that we give materials, which he suggests Gandhiji was deeply conscious of, whether it's leather, whether it's gold, whether it's copper, whether it's mud, and agnostic materials suddenly get entrenched in a caste system of materials, and we give values, and that seems to, in some level, percolate into architectural practice. While Trideep is discussing it more in terms of Gandhiji's deep intuitions of, one could say, providing a certain resistance to these biases. But I would suggest more than a resistance, the resistance is a byproduct of not accepting the prejudice. It's not with a focus on resistance. It is with a focus of stepping back and not acknowledging these biases that gets reflected as a resistance. And I think in all these drawings or all these cartographic imaginations, which I call technological imaginations, at least for the next 3 days of the forum, is really something that reveals that bias. And therefore, these are all open source drawings from the trustees of the British Museum. I'm giving these references because these are amazing repositories that one can just delve into, and it's open source. All they ask for is non-commercial and to mention explicitly that credit the source. So I would urge those who are interested to enter these repositories because they contain these kind of intuitions of technological prejudice. So actually that statement on Trideep's understanding was probably for this slide. It came a little earlier. So we can breeze through this slide a little. But I think Miki Desai's and Madhavi's work on wooden architecture of Kerala again engage with this notion of human, material, imagination, manifestation, creative excellence in the Kerala context, in a certain climatic presence. The work of so these are all different manifestations. That's Eric Moss's drawing. And this was this idea of the spider and the beehive were more to convey that they do not carry a doubt on their architecture, but human beings wish to carry that doubt and should continue that doubt, because that's the provocation of trying to make more sense of the world around us. We are more interested to understand the world, understand ourselves, and technology then becomes the context. Technology becomes the malleable context for that creative understanding. A concern that, or rather an interest, not a concern, over the last few years has been to kind of investigate or probe what kind of materials with a sense of renewability may emerge in the context of what we see as climate change. And there's a larger conversation on biological materials which are renewable, which can be grown in certain very specific contexts without disturbing or without destroying forests. And because human existence has to continue and we need material of a certain kind. So this idea of an organicity, the fact that something simple like a seed can be planted and it grows into a tree, which means there is some genetic inspiration for the seed to grow into a tree to produce material, can become one of the ways of looking at a renewable cyclic process of inhabitation on this planet. Of course, there's a choice of moving to other planets also for those who are interested, but right now we remain on this planet. And so we come to the last part, architecture as technology. That was what the KVDF forum had said, the third sub-theme. But I would try to look at it as architecture as armature. And one of the most simple yet profound manifestations of that, personally, would be Charles Correa's Gandhi Memorial, where you have a certain armature and a certain porosity that conveys the spirit of a persona like, complicated persona like Gandhiji, and yet is egalitarian. You can have almost any, the rich, the poor, any community, and that's how Charles Correa describes it. Professor Balsavar has written a very insightful essay on it, and I'm sure many have. But I think that's the idea of that distillation, where this line between what you call technology and what we call architecture, or imagine architecture as some kind of, I don't know, embellishment of, these are not words I use, but embellishment of technology. But so if there is that kind of sublimation where architecture and the lines between what we think of as architecture or think of as technology begin to blur, and then we get this armature, which almost reminds us of Rickworth's Adam's House in Paradise, where you come to first origins, where you come to the origins of something, where you come to something so primary that it kind of transcends what was done to a zone of maybe pure consciousness without the aid of any medication. So you come to that state where one is actually beginning to understand human presence in a manner of freedom, in a manner of spontaneity, in a manner of flexibility, where even if guidelines or rules prevail, they in no way can diminish the act of existence. So I call the first rudimentary the Pompidou Center, flexible, hybrid, transformed the notion of public space in Paris, shocked because revealed, and this was in the mid-80s, we were just early architecture students at that time, and later Bernard Cohn was commissioned to reimagine this Les Halles area with Pompidou Center. And so there is a very rudimentary nature of armature here. And of course, Atma Ahmedabad, which one can go to, where one almost asks, where is the building? It's as much as an armature that kind of is a Haveli of sorts. A Haveli, probably the root is from very similar to Hawa Mahal, or there is a kind of non-being of that, of the presence of that structure. And then Sagrada, which again, the reason I brought in Sagrada, because I think the religion of parametric architecture kind of sees that as one of the origins of this idea of parametry, but in an analogous way, not in a machinistic way, that somebody could generate through a catenary, and that model lies in the basement of the Sagrada. It's an amazing model to experience, where through that understanding of gravity, inversion of the chain, one had the courage to actually convert it with large boulders, which could probably have never been calculated at that time. And I recall now conversations with Mr. Mahendra Raj, when the early large span structures, when he had returned from New York, were built, whether it's the stadium here or the Rajreval, where in the absence of technology, the design of this architecture's armature, architecture of structure, was done with pure intuition of its ability to stand. And this takes me to, there's this little randomness here, but this takes me to an assignment that Professor R.J. Shah is to give us in the third year, that you do not understand technology through construction, but understand it at its breaking point. That if we are able to understand that breaking point of a certain structure, that's when one starts engaging with this understanding of construction itself. So the breaking point now doesn't become oppositional to construction or architecture. The breaking point becomes complementary, and a larger understanding of the relationship between human aspiration and the desire or need to kind of shape habitat. So these are all certain conversations that lend us back to that contemplation on beginning to make sense of not only this gravity of our own weight on the planet, but also in relationship to how these layers of relationship, these layers of relating to a very harsh, hostile environment. There could be a lightning, heavy rains, some tiger that suddenly emerges, anything. And then architecture really begins to kind of generate that sense of, or technologies, for the sake of the forum again, technology then begins to generate those layers of beginning to filter the unpredictability. It doesn't go, but it gets filtered to understand a certain level of predictability and comfort that we desire as human beings in order to be creative and search deeper. So there is this very nebulous oscillation between the desire for predictability and the desire for unpredictability. Anything too much is something that will not work with us. And so structure at that point begins to situate itself in that nebulous zone of the predictable and unpredictable. So this is architecture's amateur, and I've, for the sake of the lecture, added some terminologies, not to be taken too seriously, please. And so it means that if in moments of our time that are showing rapid technological change, rapid social change, this notion of housing that still comes with, I think it's called 1 BHK to something like 2 BHK, 4. This notion of housing that comes measured by room needs a re-examination on the genealogy of inhabitation. And in this collaborative engagement, you would definitely have some economist, you would have probably a enlightened developer at some level, an architect, and anthropologist, environmentalist. In this collaboration, it's probably the architect or the possibilities of an architectural understanding that a new way or a new genealogy of inhabitation, of housing would reside. So in this collaboration, so we're really looking at how do these materials, whether it's elemental, whether it is prefabricated, whether it is assembled, whether it is transitional, whether it is more ephemeral and can change, whether it's random, that it opens an opportunity for technological innovation, technological creativity, because there is a very profound and deep need within our society to question how do we want to live in this new phase of what is generally termed a climate emergency. How do we want to live with this rapidity? That are there more flexible ways of living? Are there more, or are there other ways of exploring how we shape our cities? So architecture these are all, again, as I said, the titles are to be taken with a certain lightness. Architecture is nature's armature. So whether it's an architecture, a pavilion that provides an experiential filter to our relationship to water, not a functional relationship like a well or a bore pump, but a relationship which gathers imaginations of community, imaginations of communication, imaginations of various other social groupings in relationship to water, versus today the pump that we have in our apartments, to switch it on and off, and nothing against it, it's very useful, but I'm more opening up this idea that it is probably a moment to open up several other imaginations if they are relevant. And just the idea of a pavilion that can be inhabited in so many different ways. Again, the architecture as a monastic armature, and again some precedents, and I come back to the structure of Mahendra Raj or maybe the Indian Institute of Management. Again, Khan being deeply influenced by the ruins, Carcassonne, so many other ruins, attempting to capture that spirit. Then of course the Gandhi Ashram, maybe a village hut that is so rudimentary that it is a tenuous edge on the way in which one inhabits the planet itself. And in this case I bring in IIFM again as an ephemeral relationship between, I would say it's a topographic relationship. And you really begin to ask, where is the building? And though you see it, you begin to ask where it is. And I think that kind of transcendence of of structure, of material, of imagination. So I come to an exploration that we've been engaged in the last few years, and the generosity of 3 architects who invited us into their studios to examine their working processes, their drawings, their models, visit the structures, look at the detailing, question. So it was a relatively rigorous process. Eric Moss, it began with Eric Moss, and then Frank Gehry at 96, and Tom Main, I think, is 84 or 83. But with a certain youthful sense of engaging with this idea of technology and manifestation, and some of the most complex technologies used within the studio to make drawings, but always returning back to the hand drawing, returning back to a watercolor, returning back to a model handmade, returning to making fragments of the building in wood which can be touched, which can be assessed, as a necessary condition of engaging with the digital. And I found that these practices, and it's the same with Foster's, many of these practices, have recognized that this, what Palasma calls the hand as the extension of the mind, is probably necessary to these practices. Maybe to others it's not, but to these practices they find it essential in translating it into digital imaginations before it manifests in reality as a structure, to respond in a nuanced way to the needs of that program. If it's an auditorium, it works as an auditorium. If it is another space, it's a university, it needs to work with all the parameters of the university. And I think at a certain level, within a certain zone, these kind of incomplete possibilities, if they are done in a certain exceptional way, whether a whole city could be of these structures, one is not sure, but they stand in a dialogue with other kinds of buildings, and therefore evolve a certain presence. This is a quick detour again to films, art, literature. This is Bhupen Kakkar's work and Italo Calvino. I'll close now. Calvino and the Dune. And then this again is just a measure of time. I'm just been told I've already run the time. So I'll end with, anyway, this is the last slide. And this is a project we're running on the City of Water, where we're looking at privileging water over land and how the technological expression would inverse if one were to privilege water over land. And so this is a series of writings which have been instituted by Stephen Hall, where we're looking at this whole idea of inversion of urban realities to privilege water over land. So I think I will end with this, though it's the last slide. And thank you for the patience and being here. And yeah, this was an unpredictable invitation, but thanks to all. Thank you. And I look forward to the 2 days of the forum. Thank yous to the KVDF team as well.
We thank Durganand sir for his insightful presentation, and we look forward to exploring these ideas on the theme in the discussions over the next 2 days. Although we are running a little late, we have a documentary which highlights the various technological innovations that have shaped the Indian subcontinent. The documentary has been put together by the KVDF documentation team. Could you play it from there? Thank you. Thank you.
Before there was fire, mankind never stepped out into the dark. Before there was the wheel, mankind was confined to the extent of their feet. Before there were tools, mankind molded and made with hands. Before there was the brick, man lived under the shelter of nature, under trees and within the dark depths of caves. Once there was brick, man built a house for himself, and then a home. Our lives are intricately woven within the threads of technology into the tapestry of human evolution, where each surge of advancement emerges as a reflection of the technology of its era. These shifting paradigms in technology intricately mold the essence of existence, subtly transforming the very spaces we occupy and inhabit. What we experience now is a product of the technology of the past, in the same way that the technology of now shapes the future. Step by step, brick by brick, humanity and its various habitats have been slowly forging ahead. There is no other period in the history of time which emphasizes the broad and power of innovation more than the Industrial Revolution. Spanning from the late 18th to the early 19th century, this period saw the birth of the groundbreaking innovations like ocean liners, grain silos, aeroplanes, and automobiles, technical beauties which, according to Le Corbusier, are the commencing of a new age. A great epoch has begun. There exists a new spirit. There exists a massive work conceived in the new spirit. It is to be met with a particularly industrial production. Architecture is stifled in custom. Our own epoch is determining day by day its own style. Our eyes, unhappily, are unable yet to discern it. It is right before our eyes. Eyes that do not see. The great age of the machine has arrived, and with it, architecture has witnessed the appearance of a new element, the mass production spirit. The engineer, inspired by the equipment of our time, has substituted for the stone and brick of yesterday, glass and steel. The invention of steel was groundbreaking to not only the spirit of engineering, stark, uncompromising lines of brutalist architecture, one discovers a haunting romance that intertwines with the very fabric of industrial innovation. Steel and concrete, the twin titans of modern construction, enable a daring reimagining of space, giving rise to monumental structures that rise like stone sentinels against the horizon. These materials, born of industry's relentless pursuit of progress, shape a world where raw, unadorned forms speak of a dystopian vision. A vision where humanity's ambition for permanence and grandeur clashes with the harshness of its own creation. In these concrete giants and steel skeletons, the fusion of technology, might, and existential reflection forms a melancholic yet mesmerizing ode to a foreboding future. dawn of new technological advancement opened a gateway to uncharted architectural exploration, liberating designs from rigid confines of brutalism. With each innovation, architects became dream beings, their imagination soaring to explore forms and geometries previously confined to the realm of man.
Technologies are helping evolve new kind of hybrids of buildings which we had never thought of before, and it has opened up immense opportunities for our younger generation and a chance to explore new kind of buildings within new kind of contexts, and to the extent of even imagining cities which are partly underground, because very much the need, and there have already been visions about that, which we keep seeing in through competition. Like in the Guggenheim Museum competition, what we did was, because the density of Manhattan is so strong, and of the skyscrapers, we felt we didn't want to do one more skyscraper within that context. We decided to take our building underground. The building goes almost 30 to 35 stories beneath the surface of the ground, and we decided to have an open plaza on the ground, very much needed in such dense urban context. And the brief given to us was such that they want to preserve all this painting collection for posterity and future generations. And we felt at this stage, because of the climate change, it would be wiser to go into the innards of the earth, and that is where we feel the paintings would be safe. So that's why our building goes down almost 30 to 35 stories down below. Now, of course, in order to imagine this such a construct, we have to also think about how the construction would happen. So that is where the technology part would come in, where we did talk with a couple of consultants, and they mentioned that the same technology which was used for mining purposes would be the same kind of technology which could be applied over here in order to go down deep into the earth and create a whole void. So the reason for giving this example is this did help us, clarify new technologies are helping evolve new kind of hybrids of buildings which we had never thought of before, and it has opened up immense opportunities for our younger generation, and a chance to explore new kind of buildings within new kind of contexts, and to the extent of even imagining cities which are partly underground, because very much the need, and there have already been visions about that, which we keep seeing through competition.
The ability to make this beautiful marriage of marrying density calls for a in very elemental way of being. So like people have started doing aluminum beam, learning about the form of pure force and understanding this form in 3 dimension is very helpful in 3D modeling, 3D modeling or 3D printing. Experiential. It is no way two-dimensional, it is experiential. You can feel the concentration of elements through texture. Either it is one layer, it is two layer, you can feel that. So
times, the successful strategy is to make the new structure completely independent of the old. And that is where there are immense opportunities in infusing a new structure and inserting a new structure within the old to take up the new, and then readapt some of the old and existing structures also at the same time. Of course, the innovation is not only in the form of the new structure to be interspersed within the old, but the innovation is also about rethinking of services as to how they were at. And another thing about adaptive reuse which excites me is that we let the old building be the way it is, and one of the ways to respect this is to come up with an insert which is very new, which is very much of our times, which clearly shows that that is old, that is new, both of them work together. There is some sensibility of the old which has come into the new, but at the same time, it is very meaningful dialogue which happens between them.
Space making is when you look at a material, a particular density. A particular density, when you are looking at a density, sometimes heavier density is dictated by gravity. technology, the lighter density is dictated by stiffness. So how does this beautiful marriage of densities? So for example, look at a bundle of paper which has so much of area, surface of area, is tied by a thin steel wire. So what is the purpose of the steel? To control, to stabilize this bundle of paper. What do? You marry steel wire to tie this bundle of paper. So you are inducing through tension, compression on paper. So you are inducing density into a very low density material.
Technologies of the global north differ from technologies of the global south when put into the context with site, climate, society, etc. Hence, there is a difference in the kind of innovations as well. A vast part of the global south still looks at labor-intensive technologies of the hand.
As the machine, we tend to concentrate and focus on the machine part, technological part. That's its material structure, the envelope, the organization, new techniques of assembly. All that comes in. And even in the living part of it, how we live itself has its own technologies which are not necessarily based or connected directly with the technologies of the world. And so, we tend to think about the history of the house as the technologies of the envelope or the technologies of the structure. Unfortunately, I think that is what has happened. We misunderstood the role of technology in the making of architecture in relation to architecture and our lives which unfolds in. And therefore we separate, and therefore we think also that this question of only looking at technologies vis-a-vis building is separate. In our city and our context, some of the houses always crack open. The houses are a little bit unfinished. And you can see life inside. And therefore the relationship between the technology of the envelope and the technologies of life somehow have always been somewhat visible.
The hand is remembered through shape. You see it. The hand should be remembered through the act of making. The birth of the brick happened between two hands, between two eyes, between two ears, in front of the nose, to the width of your head, which is 230. Why people are not made 1 meter brick? Because the hand decided that I will make to the limitation of my scale. You know what? Pot tiles, you have these pot tiles made of the thighs in Siberia or somewhere. So the thigh is bigger and thinner. Every element of the body has created amazingly. We are duplicating hand, but nobody knows what is the potential of every technology is come out for a particular requirement, and then you can apply it. Looking at technology and then starting building may not be the right way. You create technology to the need of it.
These modern cities are being developed with the help of technological advancements like cement, steel, glass and all those things. So that's how we are able to go for skyscrapers and all that. But we are also kind of neglecting the fact that even with earth construction it can be possible. So I'm talking in terms of an urban context. If we have examples in Yemen and all that where people have built 7-storied buildings to 10-storied buildings with just earth as the material, building a multi-story building without a concrete slab. So if you ask me, the method which we use with vaulted structures and dome structures to build your intermediate floors and to build multi-storied apartments all in a load-bearing structure is a cutting-edge technology to us. So we are using this to reduce as much as cement as possible, to reduce as much as the so-called cutting-edge technology in the outside world.
Different types of cross-laminated bamboos are there. Buildings are coming. Our aluminum composite panels, that is also material. And there are 25 buildings there with that cross-laminated bamboo. They completely avoided steel. But the time being the cost is there. Similarly, if it is a composite building, a bamboo, not only mud, you can make a composite building. We can also make multi-story building with the maximum use of band. You can replace entire steel and concrete, not only the steel reinforcement with band. You can replace the concrete also with band, RCC, and their slab can be converted into bamboo slabs. Our office building, we are looking at the frame structure with bamboo slabs, and the walls also with bamboo. 80% material is renewable and recycled, and 20% material only with steel and copper. Now the technology we are using to improve or increase the lifespan of that band. That technology, when we mix with our traditional methods, that will help to improve the time span of that particular material. In a bamboo building, presently we can say its lifespan is more than 100 years. And concrete technology, when we rely on concrete technology, that is also less than 100 years. Then if it is both equal, bamboo and you have to think about how much carbon sequestration happening in the group. When you are using cement and steel for a construction, you are releasing carbon, which is added to the climate change. But when you are using bamboo instead of cement, bamboo will store carbon in its system. It is absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and store that carbon in the bamboo stem. Means all of us are storing carbon, not releasing carbon.
We use powdered concrete only for making solid walls and solid foundations, but we have not tried having reinforcements in these bars. Because basically earth as a building material does not go along with steel reinforcements or steel bars, because steel corrodes in contact with earth. We were trying to make powdered beams to see how that works with respect to a reinforced concrete beam. We do not use any kind of formwork or shuttering to make a walls and domes. That is also like a technological element, but you need to understand how things work, and that is kind of a technology advancement from our side, I would say. We also use extensively ferrous cement technique to build structures. So what happens is you get these thin profiles of cement based elements where you can make flexible doors, gutters. So we use these gutters where cast the concrete beam inside the gutters itself. We don't need a shuttering on the outside. The next one would be interlocking blocks, which are developed from the Aurum press. It reduces a lot of time. It's even less than your conventional building. The recent powdered technique which we developed, what happens is powdered is as strong as a CACB structure, as strong as a Randolph structure. It can take a lot of load. It is a very good load bearing method. Same time, it is also quicker compared to the other techniques. For us, that is also a technological advantage.
In a developing country like India, there's a huge gap between advanced knowledge systems and the resources available to implement it. The crux of Indian innovation, however, lies in that gap.
So it's not just that the epoch, the technological base is transforming. It seems to be transforming things very fast. But when you actually walk around and look at things and look at the physicality of our world, largely remain the same. Therefore, one begins to wonder on what does this technology really.
In his essay titled The Indian Way of Thinking, A.K. Ramanujam highlights how Indian thought is characterized by its complexity and nuanced understanding of reality. Unlike linear or dichotomous approaches, Indian thinking often embraces paradoxes, multiple perspectives, and a holistic view of knowledge.
If you have a house which is built with cement and fire bricks and, let's say, steel and all that, you are kind of tagged as a well-settled, financially stable person. So if your neighbor does it, you also want to do it. So that has become a mindset nowadays, and this has led up in a butterfly effect where we have all forgotten the actual value of older traditional techniques. But even these traditional techniques can be put into cost-effective situations. If you look at the current context, it will not be, because what happens is the laborers which are executing these kind of buildings have become skilled laborers, because they have all forgotten how these techniques have to be done. So they have become the so-called skilled laborers, and that is why the rates in terms of labor is increasing. So if you take the context of, let's say, any earth construction technique, the material which you're getting is mainly earth, and earth is found everywhere under your feet. So this reduces the material cost, but again, being a skilled labor, that's where the cost.
It is said that necessity is the mother of invention. This notion, driven by the aspiration to achieve maximum efficiency with minimum resources, is what drives the Indian concept of jugaad.
For us to become more cost effective, we have ways interlocking blocks and extensively use CACB as the technology. CACB requires a specific kind of soil. We need more of a sandy soil. What happens is here in Auroville we have a silty sand soil. To explain it better, every soil has different elements, 3 different elements majorly. Clay being the finest of them, silt being the next biggest, and then sand being the biggest. Largest one. So we need sandy soils for CACB to work because sand is the element which takes more compression in a block. Here in Auroville we have a silty sand soil, so the percentage of silt is a little bit more, and what we try to do is we adjust it with adding more sand, river sand or M sand in recent cases, and this is going to change not just within different states but even within a smaller radius. So even within 1 kilometer radius you will find different kinds of soil. Earth Institute as a unit, we try to adapt this based on the material itself. Any traditional method which you take, even though how much ever you want to develop that technology, you are going to have site-specific limitations or conditions which you have to adjust to. We always start our projects with that. Our first step to do a project is to check the soil to understand whether it's suitable or not. And being a site-specific method or technology, it also kind of reduces the cost, or being the jugaad approach, like being the maximum efficiency and minimum cost as much as possible. We reduce a lot of transport, we reduce a lot of unwanted materials in the site, but we have been trying to incorporate mobile houses, disaster resistant houses, and cost effective houses. The disaster resistant which were used after the Bhuj earthquake is also part of the jugaad approach because they wanted to build the house in a very short time and as cost effective as possible because these people were affected by a natural disaster. Imagine the amount of work put into there. The roof elements, the walls, the blocks which we use, the foundation, and all the elements which were put into those houses there were all precasted and they were all pre-planned in a way that it could be put together in a shorter time. It uses a specific kind of CACB block which is called as the interlocking blocks. So this uses very thin mortar, 5 mm mortar, and it has it looks exactly like a Lego block. It has positive and negative points where you can just keep interlocking it as you go up. Because of that specific block is one of the reasons we were able to attain that speed. Build it within 72 hours or 3D printing. My opinion towards that is even though it gets things done faster, but even if they are doing normal residential scale buildings with 3D printing, I would say that it will be using a lot more energy. That is kind of adding up to the overall embodied energy of the building. We want to keep our embodied energy as low as possible as well. So when you talk about that, then going to your traditional technique to that region wherever we are doing is the best solution to go to, even though the process takes slower.
If you feel like that is very much necessary, one thing, then we have to see or we have to find a solution with the most economically good, best will. That's why it is called cost effectiveness. And we can use the material in low cost ways. That is low cost. That's a very big difference between low cost and cost effective. Very high quality material with the minimum price is cost effective. Maybe price as well as the quality is less is low cost. Our buildings are cost and energy effective.
You need to embrace technology to a great extent that it is a necessity than a fashion. For that you have to upgrade yourself, to think in 3 dimension, to visualize in 3 dimension, and an ability to be in your scale, to look at things very closely, at the same time perceive beyond your scale, you being invisible, to be able to experience forces in nature which is beyond your scale, being the temperature, pressure difference, the pull of gravity, the heaviness of density, the beautiful aspect of cloud, the immense volume of water, the monolith of a mountain. Come back to your scale, sensitize your mind to understand material in relation to this what you are perceiving. This continuous changing of your perspective needs you to think. That is when wonder happens.
It is right in front of us, eyes that do not see.
Thank you to the KVDF documentation team for putting together this varied mix of insights on the theme. We are sure these conversations are going to stay with us and resonate in the discussions that shall take place from tomorrow onwards. Hereby, we inaugurate the forum. We invite you to join us for the inaugural dinner at the Faculty of Architecture. And we would like to thank all of you for joining us today, and we hope to see you in the coming days as well. Thank you.